Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming to our AEI Education web event on Brown v. Board at 70, the mixed legacy of a landmark decision. American school children are taught that the Civil Rights Act was, in many ways, the culmination of the promise in our Declaration and in our Constitution. This consensus is, however, beginning to fray. Some significant political influencers on the right are going so far as to suggest the Civil Rights Act ought to be repealed. And of course, the critical race theory movement, which is now at least somewhat ascendant force on the left, was founded in part on a critique of Brown v. Board as a fundamentally self-interested political ploy. Still, for the most part, in public life, everyone will say that they wholeheartedly support Brown. But what exactly Brown said and what exactly Brown meant, that's where each side actually has its own version of events. And as Shep Melnick has written recently in an excellent AEI report, Brown v. Board at 70, still hazy after all these years, this is actually a feature, not a bug, of the original decision. And so much of the discourse around Brown when these anniversaries come by becomes kind of simplistic hagiography, right? It comes down to, well, Brown said that things should be good, so why aren't things good? Or you will see politicians try to shoehorn Brown to justify their own particular policy preference. I saw earlier today, as just one of many examples, President Biden used Brown to stump for universal pre-K, which is certainly not in the decision itself. Our hope with this conversation is that it will actually be a conversation, an interesting one, that you will hear from each panelist individually and in the interplay between themselves and their ideas that you haven't heard or exchanges that you haven't heard, and that it will substantively expand your understanding of what has become kind of de facto one of the seminal documents in American political life. So we're thrilled to have these three panelists with us. I will introduce them very briefly and then turn the stage over to them. First, we'll have Shep Melnick discuss his recent report for us. Shep is a professor at Boston College and an author of excellent books in civil rights, including The Transformation of Title IX, and more importantly for this discussion, The Crucible of Desegregation, The Uncertain Search for Educational Equity. Then we'll have Ian Rowe, who we are lucky to have as a fellow here at AEI. He's also the founder of the Vertex Partnership Academies in New York and author of Agency, the 4-point plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their path to power. And finally, we'll have Richard Kahlenberg, who is a director of housing policy and director of the American Identity Project at the Progressive Policy Institute. Richard is also the author of Excluded, How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. So with that, I will hand the stage over to Dr. Melnick.
I'd like to thank AEI for sponsoring this event and also for distributing my essay, Brown at 70, Still Hazy After All These Years. As Max indicated, that summarizes arguments that I develop in greater detail in my book, The Crucible of Desegregation. I'd particularly like to thank Rick and Ian for participating in this event, as well as Max for organizing it. The 70th anniversary of Brown is an occasion for assessing both the accomplishments and the limitations of that seminal decision. Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy put his finger on a key feature of Brown when he observed, quote, "Observers project their yearnings onto Brown. They sanctify Brown, they make it an icon, and invoke its constitutional authority to impose preferred policies. Liberals have done this, so too have conservatives." Now, the main cause of this partisan appropriation of Brown is the fact that Chief Justice Warren's opinion in that case said so little and contained so many ambiguities. His brief opinion did not adequately explain why segregation is unconstitutional, what desegregation means, or what steps schools must take to comply with the mandate. In 1954, the court did not follow the NAACP lawyers in endorsing a colorblind interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause. Instead, Warren's opinion relied on badly flawed social science evidence to claim that segregated schools limit Black students' ability to learn. Now, on this, we shouldn't judge Chief Justice Warren too harshly. He was trying to produce a unanimous opinion, trying to ease the South into compliance, and to appeal to the conscience of the average American. He actually wanted to make the opinion so short that it can be It could be printed on the average newspaper. The real problem came when the court at long last re-entered the picture from 1968 to 1979. In those years, the court issued a series of ambiguous, contradictory, meandering, and at times disingenuous opinions that expanded the responsibilities of lower court judges in desegregation cases without explaining the purpose of this enormous undertaking or its constitutional justification. As I explained in The Crucible of Desegregation, for decades the court has oscillated between two contrasting interpretations of Brown. I called the first one the colorblind limited intervention model, the second the racial isolation equal educational opportunity understanding. And not until the 2007 case in Seattle case did the court even explain these competing understandings. And even then, it didn't come down squarely on one side or the other. The goal of the colorblind model is to take a particularly pernicious tool, that is racial classifications, out of the hands of government officials. In the words of Clarence Thomas, the simple yet fundamental truth of Brown is the principle that the government must treat citizens as individuals and not as members of racial, ethnic, or religious groups. By prohibiting de jure segregation, court-ordered segregation struck at the heart of the racial caste system in the South. In that way, it was a remarkable success. Brown marked the beginning of the end of the hideous Jim Crow system in the South. The colorblind reading of Brown does not impose on courts responsibility for addressing more subtle forms of discrimination elsewhere in the country, nor does it authorize them to restructure public schools to promote equal educational opportunity more generally, such as pre-K, which is a good idea, but not constitutionally mandated. The alternative understanding, racial isolation, put great weight on Chief Justice Warren's brief references to equal educational opportunity in Brown. It's based on an educational theory that by the 1960s and 1970s had become dominant among civil rights advocates and social scientists. That understanding was most clearly stated in a 1967 report of the Civil Rights Commission entitled Racial Isolation in the Public Schools. The central truth announced in that report was, quote, Negro children suffer serious harm when their education takes place in public schools, which are racially segregated, whatever the source of segregation might be. Negro children who attend predominantly Negro schools do not achieve as well as other children, Negro or white. Their aspirations are more restricted than those of other children, and they do not have as much confidence that they can influence their own futures. The clear implication of this report was that the federal government should restructure public education to produce racially balanced schools, not just in the South, but throughout the country. In retrospect, we know that simply creating schools with a particular ratio of Black and white students did not in itself improve educational quality for minority kids. As this became more apparent, judges that were supervising these desegregation decrees took more extensive and more intrusive steps to improve the quality of education in the hundreds of school systems that they were overseeing. Some of these efforts worked, most did not. The social science on which judges relied so heavily was simply not able to tell them how to improve educational equality. Now, both of these interpretations of Brown could find support in Brown versus Board of Education, but each has its Achilles heel. The colorblind approach, judges soon discovered, is too easy to evade. Behind the so-called freedom of choice plans that proliferated in the South in the 50s and 60s lay administrative manipulation and informal intimidation. With few exceptions, they were a fraud. Without some type of racial body count, Southern schools would have remained segregated for a very long time. It took longer for the defects of the equal educational opportunity approach to become apparent. The fundamental problem here, as I suggested, is that it asks far more of courts and social science than they can reasonably deliver. Improving the quality of schools serving minority kids turned out to be more difficult than anyone imagined. Racial balance was not a silver bullet. Now, beginning in the 21st century, most of the desegregation orders were announced in the 60s and 70s were finally coming to an end. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court was inching away from the racial isolation understanding of Brown towards a colorblind approach. So as this long period of educational experimentation comes to a close, we have frequently asked the question, did segregation work? That's the wrong question. Given the ambiguity of the term, the real question is what particular forms of desegregation worked and which ones failed. For example, recent studies have indicated in the South, the destruction of the Jim Crow system produced impressive long-term results for Black children. But in the North, where the problems were significantly different, improvements for minority children were negligible. When desegregation plans increased school spending and reduced class size, they narrowed the achievement gap. But when they just increased the number of white children in class with Black children, they did not. So my closing warning is this: beware of sweeping invocations of those politically loaded terms, segregation, desegregation, and above all, resegregation. They almost always incorporate controversial measures of segregation and controversial interpretations of Brown. All too frequently, invocation of Brown is used to promote and legitimize particular education policies. Oppose this policy and you're turning your back on Brown. That's intimidation, not illumination. Recognize the ambiguities of Brown in later court decision should alert us to the major policy and evidentiary disagreements that lurk behind our shared interpretation of that 70-year-old decision. We can best honor Brown versus Board of Education by recognizing what it does not say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shep. And now we'll turn over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Shep. Thank you, Richard. Shep, thanks for the great essay and article. My perspective on Brown is this idea that the decision to end state-enforced segregation was obviously the correct decision, but the underlying rationale for that decision was inherently flawed. And I think even today we are suffering the consequences as we think about particularly stereotypes of the capacity of Black students. So the landmark decision rightfully deemed schools that were racially segregated by order of law were in fact unconstitutional. So de jure segregation, as Shep said, could no longer exist, right? Schools that were enforced by the government to exclusively educate white students only and mandatorily ban Black students because of their race, those could not exist. Yet this also meant de facto segregation could not exist. So these were schools that had exclusively educated Black students on a voluntary basis, even though laws did not require it, because of the interpretation of the term, quote, inherently unequal, end quote, carried with it this devastating stereotype of racial inferiority. Because encapsulated in those two words, inherently unequal, is a very noxious and racially reductionist principle that has for decades, in my view, hindered America's quest for racial progress. Shep alluded to, the lawyers argued and accepted as fact that segregation inevitably led to, quote, a sense of inferiority, end quote, among Black children. That was the predominantly accepted social science at the time. The Brown ruling essentially said that even if all other factors were equal, funding, adequate facilities, high quality teachers, great principals, didn't matter. All Black schools were nevertheless seen by the court as inherently unequal, or more precisely, intrinsically deficient. Racially segregated schools, whether formed by state legal mandate or community voluntary preference, were now treated with the same constitutional hostility by the court and thus suffered the same fate of ultimate eradication. So rather than just putting an end to forced racial segregation, the decision required that all white schools that heretofore had been segregated by law would now be forced to integrate by race, typically through busing, Black students to white schools. But all Black schools that had been segregated by choice were eventually forced to close, since they would now be deemed unconstitutional, even if those schools had superior academic outcomes. And the most vibrant example of that I certainly want to educate viewers on is one of the finest examples of Black excellence in education. 30 years prior to the Brown decision, Booker T. Washington was infuriated by the inferior conditions in which Black schools operated, particularly in the South. And he had an idea to create an entirely new network of schools throughout the South to exclusively educate Black children. And so he partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the CEO of the Sears Roebuck company. And together, with money both funded from Rosenwald and money from each individual community, Washington and Rosenwald created more than 5,000 school buildings known as the Rosenwald schools in 15 states throughout the South, communities that raised money, raised resources, Black educators, Black principals, and had phenomenal results for Black children. I mean, graduates of the Rosenwald schools include John Lewis, Maya Angelou. There's lots of data that suggests that these were schools that encouraged agency, empowered communities to determine their own futures. And yet, because of this fundamental perception that separation meant inherently inferior, these schools were ultimately shut down, all 5,000 schools. So I think it's just something for folks to be very cognizant of. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, referring to this in other cases, said, quote, "It never ceases to amaze me that the courts are so willing to assume that anything that is predominantly Black must be inferior," end quote. And I say that now as someone who has run public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan for nearly 15 years. We serve almost exclusively low-income Black and Hispanic students. It's not as if we are waiting for white students to move into the neighborhood here in the Bronx for us suddenly to have high expectations. And I'll end with how these negative perceptions, particularly of Black students, are still pervasive. Here in New York, our wonderful governor, Hochul, just last week, remarking on kids in the Bronx, she said, quote, "We have young Black kids growing up in the Bronx who don't even know what the word computer is," end quote. It's very frustrating as someone who runs schools here. I'd love to have her come visit. But while the decision was correct, this underlying indication that if it's all Black, if it's segregated, Black kids are developing an inherently inferior self-perception. And it's that narrative, that rationale that has served, in my view, to be destructive in our collective efforts to improve outcomes for students of color and all kids.
Right. Thanks so much, Ian. And Richard.
Great, thank you, Max, and thanks to AEI for having me. And congratulations to Shep on his excellent new book, The Crucible of Desegregation. And finally, pleased to be on the panel with Ian, whose work I have long admired. So Brown versus Board of Education was clearly a monumental step forward for the country. It was the first in a series of decisions that ended legally sanctioned American apartheid. A practice that we now recognize as insane, but was in 1954 widely accepted in large parts of the country. This was a system, as Dr. King wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, that, quote, distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, and the segregated, a false sense of inferiority. And he is talking here about de jure, state-enforced segregation. And we have Brown to thank for ending that system. So what should we do today, 70 years later? I hope I'm not falling into Joe Biden's trap here, talking about universal pre-K. I'll try to hew more closely to Brown and make 3 observations that do go to policy considerations. First, I think it's possible as a matter of policy to reconcile the 2 interpretations of Brown that Shep outlined. So if conservatives say Brown meant that the state should not treat students differently based on race, and if liberals often say Brown meant that integration is an important path to equal opportunity in America, school districts can honor both of those lines of reasoning by pursuing policies that integrate student bodies by socioeconomic status. So today there are 171 school districts and charter school chains that use socioeconomic indicators such as eligibility for free and reduced price lunch in deciding how choice is going to be honored. So I worked, for example, in Charlotte, North Carolina, to consider socioeconomic factors in admissions to magnet schools. There are a number of charter schools from DSST in Denver to High Tech High in San Diego that consider socioeconomic status as a way of bringing students of different backgrounds together. So these policies are clearly colorblind. They don't treat students differently based on race. And I'll agree here with Ian. I think it's deeply insulting to suggest that Black students do better sitting next to whites. The research never found that. At the same time, there is a wide body of research which makes clear that concentrations on poverty, everything else being equal, can inhibit opportunity. Now, we all know, of course, of high poverty schools that are high achieving, and God bless them for all the work that they're doing. They are extremely rare. So Tulane University's Douglas Harris found that middle-class schools are 22 times as likely to be high-performing as high-poverty schools. Now, when you separate out family and school and look just at low-income student performance on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, low-income students in economically mixed schools are typically 1 to 2 years ahead of low-income students in high-poverty schools by 4th grade in math. Second observation is that socioeconomic integration of schools can indirectly produce racial integration, which I think has enormous benefits for society, so apart from the issue of academic achievement. So I wrote a biography of Albert Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and he was asked, why do we have public schools? What is the rationale? And his answer was that we have to have a system of public schools to teach kids what it means to be an American. Now that's mostly a matter of curriculum, and I'm now working on a new project that Max mentioned at the Progressive Policy Institute on how to create a shared American identity among school children through civics and history and literature. But this also relates to integration. If you're trying to teach kids that there is a common American identity across racial lines, that's a lot easier to do in racially integrated environments. Third observation is that any conversation about school integration, I think, needs to address housing policy. We live in a country where close to 3/4 of students attend neighborhood public schools. So housing policy is school policy. And there was a fascinating natural experiment conducted in Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C., looking at the the question of whether the impact of a housing policy versus a school policy. So in Montgomery County, which is a liberal jurisdiction, they have had two ways of trying to improve academic achievement for low-income students. The first is to spend about $2,000 extra per pupil in higher poverty schools. And they invest in good things like reduced class size in the early grades and extended learning time. The second was that was what the school board did. Then the second intervention was by the Housing Authority. And they have a program known as inclusionary zoning, where when a builder develops a certain number of units, he or she has to set aside a percentage of those units for low-income and working-class families. And Heather Schwartz at the RAND Corporation looked at these two interventions and said, well, which one had a bigger impact, spending more money per pupil or providing the chance for low-income students to attend economically integrated schools? And the results were unmistakable. Integration mattered more than spending. And the math gap was cut in half between low-income students and middle-class students. The reading gap was cut by 1/3. And yet, throughout the country, we have the opposite of inclusionary zoning. We have pervasive exclusionary zoning policies that I think are tantamount to class discrimination, explicit class discrimination. These policies say, well, anyone is welcome to live in this neighborhood so long as they can afford a single-family detached home. Sometimes they'll throw in an extra requirement that it be sitting on a half-acre lot. The good news is we're seeing lots of reforms of these policies in blue states and red states. In fact, I was part of a panel recently with AEI's Ed Pinto on the ways in which conservatives and liberals can come together on that issue. But I think at the end of the day, and I'll close with this, is that if we want to realize the promise of Brown, we have to tackle some of these housing laws that keep us separated by race and class. And that's not part of a disgraceful past, as Jim Crow is, but really a central driver of educational inequality in contemporary America. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard, and thanks everybody. And we're now going to turn to a kind of a question and answer discussion session. If you have any questions that you would like for me to ask, please either tweet them with the hashtag #BrownVBoardAEI, or email them to my research assistant, Anna.Coulter. Her email is on the webpage. So I'll take the prerogative of asking just a few questions first myself. The first is maybe more of a basic factual predicate question. I'll throw it to Shep first, and if anybody else wants to comment. But Shep, in your discussion, you brought up what I think anybody who's paying attention to this week has seen of you will be bombarded by these slews of studies or headlines saying, segregation is rising to the highest levels ever. Many times these are based on interesting methodological choices. Just what's the average person to make of the headlines and what's behind them?
The average person should be confused and somewhat skeptical. I think because we define desegregation in so many different ways, we have these different measures. What do we know? I think the most important thing to understand about what's happening in school populations is that whites are now a minority, especially in large urban areas, that most schools are predominantly Black and Hispanic, with some Asian students. And for that reason, this measure of how many white students are in a Black students' class have really become, I think, close to irrelevant in most urban areas. We do know that when school desegregation orders were lifted, there was a little bit of a decline in the number or percentage of white students and Black students' classes, largely because we went back to neighborhood schools, and for the reason the Rick notes, that tends to leave marginally more segregation. But the good news is that there is some improvement, Rick could probably say more than that, in reduction in residential segregation, not as much as we'd like, but some. And I think that people should take account of what it is we want. We want to have more contact with white students, more diverse schools, which we are getting more diverse schools. That the heart of the problem is the fact that people have taken such different understandings of what the purpose of desegregation is.
Can I jump in quickly too, Max? I agree with.
Absolutely. Yes. Feel free to jump in on anything throughout the rest of the discussion. Absolutely.
Okay. I agree with what Shep has said, that some of the studies that look at exposure to white students are misleading because the white population has dropped so much. I also agree that things have racial segregation in schools has increased with the end of the desegregation orders, as one would expect. Housing is a very different situation. So housing, we've seen a 30% decline in racial segregation since the 1968 Fair Housing Act. So that's a positive development. Economic segregation, according to Sean Reardon at Stanford, has basically doubled since 1970. So very different trends on housing with respect to race versus class.
Great. And I think I'm going to move from a basic factual question to maybe.
Oh, I was gonna.
Absolutely. And sorry, go.
Sorry, I was on mute. On mute. I would just add, fundamentally, more racially and socioeconomically diverse schools are a good thing, for a whole bunch of reasons that go beyond the academics, as both Shep and Richard have spoken about. The question is, how do you achieve that? Do you achieve that through state enforced nature, and on the assumption that more racially integrated or more socioeconomically integrated schools are a necessary precursor to Black students being able to access a high quality education? And that's where I think we have to be very careful. Another one of these studies that came out a few years ago, the UCLA Civil Rights Project in 2021, they wrote, quote, "New York retains its place as the most segregated state for Black students and second most segregated for Latino students, trailing only California." They said that the civil rights, the school segregation remains a vexing issue, with Black and Latino students largely isolated from white and Asian peers. And Gary Orfield's conclusion was that, quote, "Racial segregation denies equal opportunity and creates a false path of inferior educational preparation that perpetuates inequality across generations," end quote. Again, the underlying message, again, all these things is racial segregation is inherently bad. And I just think that that's a very destructive message. And, on the point about housing, Richard, I agree with you. Again, we want more housing policy that incentivizes more racially and socioeconomically diverse communities. But again, I'm in District 12 in the Bronx, which is one of the highest poverty districts in the country, almost exclusively Black and Hispanic. I don't want our kids to believe that they need to move to a different neighborhood, or another group of people need to move in order for them to have a successful opportunity and achieve the American dream. So I'm supportive of housing policy, but the thing that ultimately is school choice. Why are we not allowing more great schools to go into these communities that may not be racially or socioeconomically diverse, but that would give kids an actual shot, regardless of the demographic makeup of their school?
Could I add quickly 2 points? First, all of us agree it'd be great to have more racially and economically diverse schools. But as usual in education policy, the devil is in the detail. So what are the trade-offs? Do you neighborhood schools or longer bus rides? I just saw a report in the Washington Post today that a majority of African-American parents want neighborhood schools. That's a difficult trade-off. That's number one. And the other point I'd make is that I think one of the features of American politics is that the federal government doesn't have much control over zoning policy. These are all local things. So when we reach for something the federal government can do, it tends to be through the lens of civil rights, and it tends to be often through the courts, and that is not necessarily the most effective lever that we have to change these important details within schools.
Yeah, and Shep, I'd add, I think every parent prefers neighborhood schools, especially in elementary and middle, where would you want to put your 6-year-old kid on a bus, to go miles away? So I don't think it's just that's something for Black parents. I think any parent wants a good neighborhood school. They don't want to have to feel that they have to move in order to have a high quality opportunity for their kid.
I can jump in. I think I'll agree with Ian that there are a lot of people who would, and I guess Shep said this too, a lot of people who would prefer a neighborhood school. And given residential patterns, it looks like that's going to be a challenge for school integration, and it is. Having said that, you can make a lot of progress on integration with a subset of parents who do want something different. And that's true with respect to housing, and it's true with respect to schools. So there was a question, for example, in Chicago, when they opened up what's known as the Gautreaux program a number of years ago, would Black low-income families want to move to suburban jurisdictions? And there were powerful reasons to think that people wouldn't. They might face discrimination. They would lose their social networks. So lots of reasons not to move. Well, at this time, this was a number of years ago, they did it by phone, and the phone system in Chicago broke down because there were so many parents who said, I want something different for my kids. What I'm living through right now is not tolerable. Now, that's not for everyone. There are a lot of people who want to stay in the community where they are. But I think this is ultimately about choice and providing those families that want something different the opportunity to engage in that choice.
Yep, I agree with that. Yeah, choice, volunteer, housing vouchers, school vouchers, anything that puts power in the hands of the parent to make the best decision for their kid, whether it's where they go to school or where they choose to live.
And the desegregation orders, some of them that worked, were the ones that relied heavily on magnet schools, controlled choice. In some ways, this was really the beginning of expanding the opportunity for parents to choose schools for their kids and not have to go necessarily to the neighborhood school. I just say I had a wonderful student who was in the METCO program in Boston, where he went from Boston to the suburbs. He received a wonderful education in the suburbs, but he had to ride an hour on the bus each way. And it takes enormous stamina and determination to do that.
Yeah, and that's unfair that burden is placed on individuals. The METCO research suggests, though, that virtually all of the METCO alumni would do it over again, even though they did face those extra obstacles. Well, we're getting close to a kumbaya moment, so let me disagree on one thing. Because Ian, I do have a different position on the school voucher issue and privatization, and we may not want to get sidetracked on that question, Max. But I would say that that is something that raises a question about American identity and whether schools are about instilling certain values that we share in common as Americans, because 80% of private schools are religious in nature, and I that's great. They can try to instill a love of a particular version of God. They have there's constitutional right for people to engage in that. That is different than instilling an American identity and small d democratic values. And so there's a as Shep was saying earlier, there are trade-offs to be had here, and I think we need to recognize those.
Yeah, and I would say I think it's absolutely essential that schools are cultivating strong civic knowledge about American history, the American identity. But that's not necessarily driven by the demographic of, that's not necessarily driven by the racial or socioeconomic demographic of the schools in the school. I mean, the students in the school. It contributes to that, certainly, but it's much more driven by what is the curriculum? What is the canon that our schools are reading? That our students are requiring, that our schools are requiring students to read. Again, here at the school I lead, Vertex Partnership Academies, we're organized around cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom that we think are universal even in nature, even beyond just America. But then we also have a canon. There's certain books that every American should read. Like every kid should read the Federalist Papers, and every kid should know Shakespeare. And so I think it's much more of a focus there than it is assuming that if you've got a racially diverse population, then therefore it's easier to teach the American identity. Or if you've got only Hispanic kids, it's harder. It's all based on what are the values, what's the content that you're deliberately teaching into.
Yeah, and I'm going to agree in part and disagree in part. I completely agree. The curriculum is incredibly important. It sounds like I would love my kids to go to your school, Ian. I mean, I love the things that you assign as part of the curriculum, and I think that's really really important. I do think that the question of racial integration is related to the question of instilling American identity. And since I've got a conservative audience here, I'll use a conservative an example that may raise the ire of some conservatives. But if we had more integrated schools and more students, more white Christian students, knew Muslims as classmates, new Mexican Americans as classmates, I think it would be harder for a demagogue to run for president saying that some groups are less American than others. And so that's where I think that, and it happens on the other side too. I mean, yep. The stuff about 1619 Project drives me nuts, where I think there are lots of reasons to fault the left on these issues as well. But I guess that's part of why I hold on to the integration ideal, is that I think it's certainly not impossible in a economically and racially segregated environment to teach kids common American values, and I applaud those institutions that are doing that. But I think it's easier when the what is modeled for students, what they see around them, reinforces the liberal democratic values.
Right. So to pick up on Richard's invitation to maybe steer us a little bit further from kumbaya moments and go back to an idea or an issue that may or may not philosophically divide the panelists, I'm very curious to see. Right, we had an interesting kind of legal course of events in the wake of students for fair admissions, which obviously was a very kind of politically divisive, ideologically divisive decision. But generally, thumbnail is that colleges can't discriminate in admissions on the basis of race under the Constitution by the court's interpretation. You then shortly thereafter had the court have a petition for cert for the Thomas Jefferson case in Fairfax County, in which it was quite apparent that the school district was using non-explicitly racial means to affect racial ends for the sake of overall integration. And some observers expected the court to take this up and knock it down. The court did not take it up at all, leaving kind of open this question, both legally, but also philosophically, from a Brown perspective, from y'all's perspective, of what exactly to make of a public institution like a school attempting to discriminate on the basis of race, but doing so without explicit recourse to race. How should we think through that legally? How should we think through that from the kind of the shared American identity perspective that Richard's talking about? So I'd love to hear all of your perspectives on this. Shep, I think I'm going to toss it to you again first.
Yeah, this is a good example of what I said about the hazards of the colorblind approach. It's so easy to evade. In some ways, in these exam schools, you have the reverse of what happened in the South in the 50s and 60s, that people found ways to keep the racial status quo without using racial classifications. And now we're using changes in the status quo to basically reduce the number of Asian Americans and increase the numbers of Black and Hispanic kids in exam schools. It doesn't surprise me that the court denied cert. If you read the lower court decisions in that case, the majority make a very strong case that we really can't get into looking behind these decisions of the school boards. They're using a reasonable determination of what's good educationally. We shouldn't second guess that. So I think we can't look to the courts to try to address that. I think we need to ask the people who are running school systems, what is the point of these specialized schools? And if you reduce the academic qualifications, are you fulfilling the goal of those schools in the first place? Now, it could be that there are, in some cases, people have made some really horrible statements to justify these changes, basically derogatory comments about Asian Americans, which is also what got Harvard into trouble. But without those smoking guns, I think the emphasis has to be on the educational issues, not the legal ones.
And I was disappointed that the court did not take up the high school case because I think they could have made even further progress on the issue. If you look at, I mean, if you have to actually look at the Harvard case, when you actually look at the data, when they looked at the percentage of Black kids that were being accepted, nearly 70% were Black kids that were recent immigrants of affluent families or middle or upper class Black Americans, kids that are doing pretty well that don't necessarily need that leg up solely based on their race. And in fact, they were probably bumping out low-income Black kids who didn't have a shot. So it kind of evidences the negative externalities of making these assumptions based on race. And I always share this data because I think there's also this kind of underlying assumption that white kids are the standard. It's also very important to note that in the National Assessment for Educational Progress, the nation's report card, in the entire history of NAEP since 1992, there has never been a year in which a majority of white students at fourth grade or eighth grade, a majority of students are reading at grade level or reading at NAEP level proficiencies. So again, this constant messaging of if it's Black, it must be inferior. We have to have all these special programs because based on color, you're inherently inferior. It doesn't actually comport with the evidence even of white students. And that's why these kind of blanket assumptions about race, again, underlying Brown's underlying decision, continues to haunt us. And we just have to break this idea that race is the determining factor of what a capacity of a school or students have to achieve.
So I have strong opinions on this question that you raised, Max. So I'm a political liberal. I was also an expert witness for Students for Fair Admissions, challenging Harvard's and Harvard and UNC's position on using race. And my view was and is that racial diversity is a good thing to have on campus, but that universities can create it without the toxicity associated with racial preferences. And they can do it in a way that comports to basic notions of fairness. That you want to, as Ian's suggesting, the 71% of the students who were African American and Hispanic, Native American at Harvard came from the richest 1/5 of the Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations nationally. So this was not kind of the original idea that affirmative action was going to uplift people who face the biggest disadvantages. So part of my testimony in the case was to say there are other ways to get racial diversity. And we talked about things like a percentage plan, like George Bush implemented in Texas, where the top 10% of high school students were admitted. We talked about socioeconomic preferences. So I was pleased that the Supreme Court ruled the way they did in students for fair admissions. I would have been appalled if the Supreme Court, by contrast, had taken the Thomas Jefferson case. I have a very, very different position on that. I mean, on that case, but I think my position is actually the consistent one, which is that for years, conservatives had said, we do not want you to use race in admissions, but of course it's okay to look at income. Of course it's okay to look at geography. That's the way to do this in a legal fashion. And all the justices made that, conservative justices made that argument for decades. So it would have been, as one judge said, the ultimate judicial bait and switch for the Supreme Court to then say, well, Thomas Jefferson, which implemented a percentage plan and provided a break to economically disadvantaged students, cannot engage in that. That's proxy discrimination. I see it exactly in the reverse, that I think for years we've been using race as a proxy for class. And Thomas Jefferson actually was doing what conservatives had long said should be done, provided a break to students who go to schools that have maybe never sent someone to Thomas Jefferson High School. I mean, one of the big differences, I'll end with this, one of the big differences at Thomas Jefferson High School after they implemented the change was that the percentage of low-income students went from 1% to 25%. And many of those students were Asian Americans, first-generation students who would not have gotten into Thomas Jefferson High School had it not been for the change in policies. Sorry, I felt a little passionately about that topic.
No, I'm excited to have the very divergent and great perspectives. I have one more question for the group, which could be, an hour on its own. We have about 8 minutes left, but Shep, you mentioned in your opening remarks that the decision in Brown was, arguably more or less predicated on a social science finding, which is not the way that American legal constitutional reasoning has traditionally worked. And it also happens to have been a social science finding that many bones could be picked with. One then saw, as you also noted a little bit in your remarks, in more depth in your excellent report, that for a while the court kind of tried to carry this torch and assumed that social science could provide substantive answers to policy problems. And eventually we realized through the example of Kansas City that perhaps the court cannot say exactly what will fix a school according to the experts. But I think this leaves a massive open question for all of us in terms of how to think about social science when it comes to desegregation, not only in the courts and legal reasoning and legal decisions, but also in policymaking more generally. So I would just love to kind of round out by hearing from each of you on, your reflections on, when should we find social science compelling, literally, and when should we be perhaps gravely skeptical, and how can we assess the difference when it comes to policies around this issue? So let's start with you again, Shep.
Okay, thanks. Couple of brief points. First, the reference to social science evidence in Brown, I think, was largely window dressing. It's a bit of a surprise that the NAACP used it because many of the people on the NAACP legal team thought it was junk science, and it was really quite bad. And it didn't, so I don't think that was crucial. I think what was much more important is when you got to the 60s and 70s, it was above all the lower courts that very frequently heard from expert witnesses, relied very heavily on the idea that if you have majority white schools, it's going to raise everybody. That was based on a consensus in the education research group that turned out to be based on very, very little evidence. When James Coleman broke with that consensus, the leading educational expert of his time, he was called a Nazi. So the danger of groupthink there is enormous. the thing, I don't want to be too negative about social science because number one, I think the evidence, the nature of research is getting a bit better. But I'll just leave with a point that James Q. Wilson, one of my mentors, made, which is that social science evidence is not very good at predicting the future. It tends to be much better at saying what has worked and what has not worked in the past. So if we have the right types of expectations, I think the results will be better.
Yeah, and as relates to social science, I mean, most people know this, but Brown, at least a portion of the rationale rested on the research that was done with Black children having an aversion to choosing Black dolls, and somehow that reinforced this idea that, again, if it's just race-based, if you're just with Black kids alone, there is this concept of inherently inferior. And so in that context, social science is leading you to very harmful conclusions. But it's like anything else. Social science has its value, and yet there are other factors that one should consider when you're taking into account policy or an approach. And again, I think we can confidently say the lesson of Brown, neither does the presence of all white students guarantee a high quality education, nor does the presence of all Black students guarantee a substandard learning environment. There are a lot of other factors that matter. The curriculum, the quality of teachers, the economic class, the level of integration, all those things matter. But when race becomes a silver bullet, where if social science, somehow people say, let's ignore everything else and narrow in on this singular factor, that's when social science, I think, can be very dangerous. And instead, let's look at those. I know where it was in Shep or Richard, you talk about high performing schools in low income communities where you have almost exclusively kids of a certain income level or of a certain race. Let's not ignore, and I know that's not what you're saying, but what can we learn from those institutions that can then be applied universally while we're thinking about housing policy, while we're thinking about all these other things to create more diverse environments. But we know that there are factors that are universal that can drive human flourishing and student achievement.
Great. And Richard, you give the last word.
Well, I'll say I'll agree that the social science in Brown was very weak. At the same time, I guess I'll cut Chief Justice Warren some slack in the sense that he pulled off a miracle in getting a unanimous opinion, and if it took throwing in some weak social science, I can live with that. He advanced the country immeasurably with that decision, and I think we can't lose sight of that. In terms of today using social science, I think it's inescapable, and certainly with respect to public policy, what else are we left with than to consider values and social science? So, and maybe I'll just end with one thing I meant to mention earlier. Shep, you were making the really interesting observation about the fact that social science suggests desegregation worked really well in the South, not so well in terms of raising achievement in the North. And that will come back to, in my mind, to the theme of the importance of socioeconomic integration. In the South, you have large school districts that are countywide. And so in places like Charlotte, upper middle class white people were part of the school desegregation effort. Not true in Boston and parts of the North. So I think there are some important social science findings that we can't ignore in our public policy, and I think that does come out of the Brown versus Board of Education experience.
Great. Well, I want to thank Shep, Ian, Richard, all of our panelists today. I certainly found this to be a very interesting and stimulating discussion. I hope that our audience did as well. And of course, thank you to our audience for tuning in. And we appreciate it, and have a great weekend to you all.
Good.
Thank
you. Sorry we didn't have more disagreement.
or more time. I feel like we could cover a lot more ground.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.